Along with the fathers today, I acknowledge the Gadigal people whose land we meet on and whose sovereignty has not been ceded. I explore the refugee and asylum seeker assessment and review systems in the context of people arriving by plane and seeking protection. The historical context of Australia's attitudes is a topic for another day. I have been assisting these people for more than 20 years. Most, but not all, claims had been rejected at all levels of the assessment and review procedures, and they were expected to go back to where they came from. My PhD thesis examined their decisions, and this research informs my work today. After reading each one's documents obtained through Freedom of Information, I was confused. From where I stood, the people I write about had credible claims according to the United Nations definition of a refugee. Yet the government's mantra was they have had their claims assessed and were found not to be refugees. So one reason for the book was to explore the credibility of this mantra. My second reason was to highlight the plight of invisible people seeking protection because there is little information in the public arena about them in comparison to all that is written about people arriving by boat and the horrors of detention centres. As a pastoral carer and advocate, rather than a lawyer, I have been lucky to be able to maintain long-term relationships with each of the people in the study. I accompanied each one to the compliance office to renew bridging visas, which would be weekly, monthly, or 3-monthly. I sat with them in lawyers' offices, tribunals, and courtrooms. I listened and I observed. One day, confidently, Amora and Marco and I fronted up to the compliance officer. I lurked in the background, vigilant. He looked at the couple, then looked at the monitor in front of him. "Didn't you receive the letter?" he said. I jumped to attention. "What letter?" said I. There before our eyes was the inevitable refusal to grant protection again. Aghast, I asked for the supervisor. We would return in an hour. In the comfort of our favourite coffee shop, I hastily called a person at the UNHCR office in Canberra. He was shocked. He had contacted Minister Vanstone's office and had received a positive response. He would call back. In a few minutes, the phone rang. He was asked to resend the material because what he had previously sent had been lost. My submission was dismissed by department officers because it was a repeat request to the Minister. At the first stage of the refugee determination procedure, for the interview, sometimes the department engaged interpreters with the same cultural background as the people identified as causing the persecution, creating an environment where it was impossible to speak freely. To avoid recognising a person was harmed because of their race, religion, nationality, or membership of a particular social group or political opinion, the Minister's delegate regularly concluded that the harm is criminal in intent and therefore not convention related. Files could not be located because they were incorrectly labelled. One psychiatrist was asked on 3 occasions to resubmit his support. Decisions were cut and pasted, and personal details such as name, sex, and country of origin were found to be incorrect. Overseas documents signed by a notary or JP or on official letterhead were not given the same status as those in Australia. they were inevitably labelled fraudulent. Concocting a negative outcome was not difficult for the assessor. When an application was made on behalf of the mother and children, the delegate found serious risk of harm but no convention grounds. A second application was made 7 years later, and again the delegate found the reason for harm was criminal activity and could not link the feared persecution to any convention reason. Each decision maker has access to all the previous files of each family member and therefore knows the historical decisions made by earlier assessors, reviewers, judges and ministers. A lowly clerk or minister's delegate in the department is hardly going to go against all of these heavies. Furthermore, delegates are under pressure. Negative decisions enhanced key performance indicators. A tribunal officer at the second stage can review a delegate's decision at a cost of around $1,500. A person cannot approach the minister to request their consideration unless having first been through the tribunal. When reviewing a decision, a tribunal officer can speculate, assume, overlook important facts, claim a person is not a credible witness, declare implausibility, and even question the veracity of DNA results. For example, one tribunal reviewer suggested that the gangsters, if such they were, who harassed the applicant's husband previously would no longer be interested in him as he no longer has a business. Kellner, a 2-month-old baby, was the applicant and too young to have a husband. Only 2 years earlier, Kellner's father had had his leg broken because he was unable to meet extortionist demands. Understandably, he retained his fear of gangsters. Redbury speculations that they had lost interest in him, that the danger had evaporated so soon, was without evidence. The bracketed phrase, if such they were, suggests Redbury's disbelief or even cynicism. Redbury's unwillingness to imagine or consider more broadly amounts to drawing conclusions from her limited experience rather than accepting the observed facts. Redbury seemed unwilling or unable to consider information outside her world or contrary to her values and beliefs. At another hearing, the same reviewer found Nankunda's claims implausible 6 times, unbelievable or incredible once, and twice said they lacked credibility. Redbury came to the bizarre and damaging conclusion about documents submitted to indicate that such practices had happened to other people. And she stated, the claims put forward by the applicant in her written testimony and restated more or less with the number of additional aspects in her oral testimony are mere assertions. They are not based on true incidents involving the applicant, but rather were composed using ideas and terminology the applicant found in the fairly random assortment of articles downloaded from the internet prior to her writing her protection visa application. After receiving Redbury's decision, this person was admitted to the psychiatric ward of a major Australian hospital. At another hearing, a male tribunal was designated to interview a young woman whose very sensitive claims were about female genital mutilation. Unknown to the lawyer, I complained and he was taken off the case. Former tribunal reviewers told me they had an unwritten expectation to pass 20% and fail 80% of their cases in order to ensure tenure renewal. To me, a refugee is a refugee, and a quota system is contrary to the United Nations Refugees Convention, to which Australia is a signatory. Unlike in situations in the broader community, at this third stage, the court has no power to decide on the merits of the claims submitted by a person appealing in the courts. They can only examine the reviewer's decision. If they find something was unlawful, all they can do is send it back to the tribunal for a further review. The reviewer has no obligation to consider the court's concerns. A second tribunal reviewer subjected the family to cross-examination of material that had already been recognised as plausible in previous decisions. This reviewer then decided that Orlando was not a credible witness, discounting earlier findings of plausibility on 2 other occasions, thus avoiding the necessity to examine the judge's conclusions. The fourth stage is the request to the Minister for consideration on humanitarian grounds. Ministerial guidelines don't oblige public servants or delegates to honour tribunal reviewers' assessments of compelling humanitarian grounds. Orlando and Belich's 8 years of persistent negotiations with the department might have been avoided if the delegate did not override a reviewer's assessment. It was only when we took their case to the United Nations Human Rights Committee in Geneva that justice finally prevailed. Orlando and Belich's pathway to protection necessitated serious costs to the taxpayer because of the engagement of 6 members of Parliament in the immigration portfolio, 3 delegates of the Minister at the initial application stage, 4 tribunal reviewers, lawyers representing the Minister in the federal and high courts, and on one occasion, legal aid representing the children. Public servants in the Ministerial Intervention Unit, the Compliance Office, the Freedom of Information Office, the Attorney General's Office, the International Obligations and Interventions Office, and the Government Debt Collectors. The staff of the Dobbin and Illegal Desk, detention centre staff, and the staff at the Australian Embassy in Geneva. During the 10 years that the Australian government rejected the case, the family's resilience was strengthened by their fear of being returned. Over the years, I have found that different representatives of the Minister contradicted each other's decisions and delegates' assessments, and public servants overrode tribunal reviewers' advice. Negative interpretations of guidelines and intimidation by public servants have long-lasting effects. Insidiously, decisions are actually made at the departmental level and either handed on to the Minister through advisory notes or finalised in the department on the basis of personal interpretations of guidelines, rendering ministerial authority tokenistic. Now we move from the immigration system to a window into the lives of the people surviving, despite this prejudiced, unfair, inequitable system. Once they received their negative tribunal review decision, they immediately lost the right to work. Following a negative result at the courts, they were landed with huge court costs, despite not being allowed to earn a living. After the Minister refused to consider their humanitarian request, they had to leave Australia, as there was no possibility of obtaining a further bridging visa. Alternatively, they survived in the community, working for cash and depending on handouts from small business owners who lowered prices, some school principals who didn't include children on the roll, pro bono doctors as they received no Medicare, and pro bono lawyers. Advocates in all walks of life are to be commended for their resistance to cruel policies and practices in the way they reached out to these people. People seeking Australia's protection relied on luck and resourcefulness, but lived in a permanent state of fear, afraid that they would be caught, dragged off to the detention centre and deported. 3 spent time in detention. Orlando's employer dumped him in. Vassal was taken from the compliance office for not having presented tickets to depart Australia. But for the public tantrum staged by his 4-year-old daughter, she and her mother would have also been detained. Aloysia was found voluntarily helping out in his friend's restaurant. Then there were employer exploitation. After the minister threatened farmers with huge fines if people without visas were found on their property, some scoundrels saw an opportunity. They set up as middlemen, employing the farmhands, providing cheap, inhospitable accommodation and distributing wages after extracting their costs. Sarita was picking cucumbers. When she went to collect her money, the middleman had disappeared with her money and that of many of the other farm workers. This happened regularly. In the city, others reported being paid something sometimes. Hamey was contracted for 3 months. When he went to collect his substantial amount of money on Christmas Eve, he was asked to show the employer his papers. The children received no Christmas presents that year. The most intense and persistent fear was around being caught without a visa. People driving would almost freeze when they heard a siren. The first thing they did on a new job or visiting someone was to check all the entrances and exit points, whether on construction sites, in meeting places, or even my house. Some were under constant surveillance. After reporting a suspicious white car parked daily outside one home where there were children inside, the car disappeared. When there was a suspicious knock at the door, Nankunda slid down a rope tied on the balcony at the rear of her unit and disappeared until her flatmate assured her it was safe to return. 5 police cars arrived to collect La Donna and her family. Forcefully they demanded she and her 9-month-old baby, the only ones home, go with them to the detention centre. The baby was agitated and literally screaming. The female officer relented and told her to report to the compliance office within the next 3 days. The cavalcade departed. Amy and the other children arrived home, and along with La Donna, they immediately put everything on the nature strip and disappeared. At that time, police raids were popular news items. Children were hauled out of schools, adults taken from their workplaces, people dragged onto planes by burly guards. The biggest fear for the children was that one day their parents would not return from work. One teenager found school difficult enough. The conversations of her peers seemed superficial and insignificant after all she had experienced in her home country and now here in Australia. She withdrew from the school and would spend hours in her comfort zone, the shower, waiting nervously for her parents to arrive from work. Another child excitedly waited for the primary school children next door to arrive home, as they would spend the next hour teaching her what they had learned that day. She was 8 years old when I met her and had never been inside a school. Without work rights, the parents couldn't afford the overseas fees. The one common thread for most of the people that I was able to assist was a strong sense of their human rights and their disillusionment when discovering that Australia flouted them. Thank you.
Peter, thank you for the invitation to speak at Politics in the Pub, and I also want to acknowledge the Indigenous owners of our various locations, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, their hospitality and forbearance to those of us who are later comers, and their unaddressed injustices which have implications for us all. Also, asylum seekers and those who work with them, human service professionals and others, and to my colleagues in the asylum seeker advocacy group, some of whom are here today. I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist who, with colleagues, has worked on this issue for over 20 years, and like Aileen, we've been in harness for a very long time. And I want to briefly discuss the ethics of healthcare in immigration detention and recent developments in that context before examining the idea of the Royal Commission into immigration detention and celebrating Aileen's important book. Aileen's book is a really important book. It's extraordinary privilege to stand with you here, Aileen. You're to celebrate your advocacy, your work over so many years, and your doctorate, and it's a powerful, impassioned book. It shows extraordinary fortitude and burning concern. The case studies are meticulously documented and heart-wrenching, and the book undertakes research never previously undertaken. This is not in the public domain, by revealing this Byzantine web of unexamined legal and bureaucratic cruelty that affects Australia's racist and immigration policies. Yes. So before discussing, I think it's wonderful to actually to read it. It's actually also very clear on the issue of the links with Indigenous people, best in law, which I find profoundly compelling. So I'm very grateful for the book. Before discussing remedies and strategy, I briefly reviewed the problem. For 30 years now, Australia's enforced indefinite immigration detentions for irregular boat arrivals, a paradigm policy of what's been called hostile hospitality, with many connected policies, including temporary protection of various kinds, being later joined to it. Hannah Arendt observed the wide gulf between universal abstract juridical human rights and the state sovereignty that decides to grant citizenship. Talk of inalienable human rights is empty for stateless people and for asylum seekers who are denied such rights, sometimes for decades, who existing outside the polis are dehumanised and don't count. But as Australia's racist history can also be traced in its operation, this is beyond my brief today, but the legal connections, as I said, are all spelled out in Aileen's book. I last presented at Politics in the Pub on this same topic in May 2004. Rereading what I said then, I was on the podium with Winton Higgins, who's wonderfully here today. We spoke about something fairly similar on that occasion. Rereading what I said then, I note that the more things change, particularly, for example, departmental names and detention contractors, the more they stay the same. At that time, health professionals and others were discovering, documenting and publicising the mental disorders and human rights abuses of indefinite detention and of temporary protection. These negative effects were not well known, and the Howard LNP government publicly denied them, arguing that health advocates made unfounded or partisan claims, and that indefinite detention's aims were non-punitive, and even that it was humane. felt like it was in the Medical Journal of Australia to that effect.
Shame.
Government-funded research, however, subsequently verified these negative effects, and officials quietly confirmed them at public hearings in the second Children's Human Rights Commission report in 2014. Important drivers have been increasing policy-driven securitisation and secrecy, lack of independent regulation, and outsourcing and privatising detention for profit since 1997. All these three factors contribute to compromising accountability. Adopting a health professional lens briefly on this topic, this also affects healthcare in immigration detention, which, unlike prisons, operates under the governance and control of the Immigration Department, the Department of Home Affairs. This is despite border security and healthcare having fundamentally different priorities and values. From 2013, governments ceased consultation with healthcare bodies. They don't accept professionals' duties to practice according to established care standards and refugee needs, nor, despite disclaimers, do they provide universal quality healthcare that's equivalent to primary or community healthcare. Healthcare's non-independence, the system's lack of accountability, and the underlying mismatch of priorities and values can be seen as three factors that irretrievably compromise healthcare ethics. Thus, detention health clinicians find clinical roles and ethical obligations disrupted and witness and have to live with systemic human rights abuses. This also leads to anomalies such as the minister being both guardian and custodian of child asylum seekers. There are three dilemmas basically for health professionals, and I won't go on about this in detail, but I'm just outlining them briefly. Problematic dual loyalty, so the conflict between a doctor's primary duty to the patient and duty to a third party that jeopardises ethical behaviour. Secondly, being thwarted from pursuing scientific inquiry and evidence-based interventions. And thirdly, facing personal anxiety and psychological distress over these moral dilemmas and deciding whether to leave or remain. So there are risks, in the first instance, there are risks of collusion with the policy when detention agents, who are often administrators, risk or invite collusion with the policy, breaching ethical norms, like participating in abuses to serve state interests, allowing state policy to limit or deny care, remaining professionally silent about abuses and neglects, breaching clinical confidentiality, and compromising one's independent medical judgment. There are many examples of these that are current and in the domain right now. So allowing manacling and guarding of hospitalised patients, that happens. Misdiagnosing self-harm as manipulation or personality-driven while ignoring overwhelmingly traumatic contexts, and not reporting vital information, for example, detention's mental health statistics. The lack of scientific inquiry and evidence-based interventions, frontline clinicians testify that interventions are ineffective in detention, they serve mixed ethical ends, that mistrust erodes the therapeutic relationship, and independent research isn't approved and it is an undertaking. You cannot do research in immigration detention. And professionals face vicarious traumatisation through their exposure to abuse and trauma, insoluble predicaments, invalidation, narratives of horror, moral injury, so questioning about the collusion with state priorities, betrayal and contamination, and insensibility, which are the social justice issues. And many of our colleagues have left these jobs for such reasons. So there's been resistance to this. Many of you would be aware of this via various United Health organisations, professionals, asylum seekers, and concerned citizens in local and global resistance. It's taken many forms, and there are arguments for and against boycotting detention, which I'm obviously not going to review now, but the important fact is that despite all of this, the policy hasn't changed. Fast forward to today. So immigration detention, indefinite detention, remains bipartisan policy, entrenched under its successive governments. Britain, US and Canada seriously consider following similar trajectories. The length of immigration detention, no country compares with Australia. Health professionals have thoroughly documented indefinite immigration detention's harms, and alongside jurists such as the International Criminal Court and other bodies, we have often observed how successive governments persistently and recklessly mistreat asylum seekers. However, it's not just that. Not only that, but Australian governments have, to date, and one hopes this is going to change, I'll come to that, but fully understand and accept these policy-based injuries and sometimes deaths. They've reported and have acknowledged the harms and believe them justified to deter and to force repatriation. So the ends justifies the means. The measurable as well as immeasurable harms of indefinite detention are inflicted for various purposes. They're for scapegoating, deterrence, punishment, security, political advantage and private profit. Now, making detained asylum seekers suffer to coerce them to abandon their claim fulfils international codes regarding torture. It violates Australia's international legal commitments, its cruelty has been condemned in the highest international forums, and it's attracted outspoken opposition from health personnel. Yet government policies persisted, governments failed to remediate these confirmed injuries which involve both abuse and neglect, which suggests that the harms actually are intentional. In fact, injured detainees and service providers have received substantial out-of-court settlements to avoid government exposure. If health professionals, however, thought that knowledge and reasoned argument would bring insight over the last 20 years, we were sorely mistaken. Any member of the public also who wants to know about any of this can readily find the information. Immigration detention, most of the information, some of it's obscure, but the stuff I've just spoken about is much of it's available to us. Indefinite detention applies to those in so-called held detention onshore and offshore, in alternative places of detention like hotels, apartments, hospitals, aged care facilities, mental health inpatient facilities, in residential housing, transit accommodation, or under residence determination in the community. And on top of those, also in the community, more than 31,000 people live in limbo without status resolution, or have been irregular maritime arrivals from almost 10 years ago. They include the so-called legacy caseload and the Medivac cohort returned from remote regional processing centres in Nauru and PNG, some further on bridging visa ease, some having work rights, some not, with many unable to access income support, and some 2/3 hold temporary visas which allow them to work but which don't allow family reunion. Under current Australian law, none of these people will realistically ever have access to permanent visas, and they will never feel they're settled or belong. I also note here the 501s, non-citizens or perhaps dual citizens who've lived many years of their lives in Australia and have served a prison sentence of more than 12 months or more and are due to be deported, leaving their families behind, and those seeking protection who have arrived by plane that Aileen's just spoken about. All of these people are in limbo, and they show well-documented harms which affect adults and children. We've been hoping that the new government offers a new strategy, and at the Jobs and Skills Summit this week, and Immigration Minister Andrew Giles announced 36 million for 500 extra staff to address the backlog of visas for skilled migration, to help business start running again, and to process the crippling backlog of active non-humanitarian visa applications standing at 962,000 when Labor took office in May. But what can we expect in relation to refugees and asylum seekers? We haven't seen much yet. On one hand, the new government does seem to turn to fixing the onshore humanitarian program. Indications that, from obviously the acceptance of the Bill of Wheeler family placing them back home, and that Labor plans to abolish temporary protection visas and make them permanent, to relax some requirements regarding them, and potentially a raft of other changes in relation to that. On the other hand, there's disappointment that although Labor had announced its intention to bring immigration detention back into public administration, and although Canstruct's contract was expiring, they've given the contract to another group from the US, Management and Training Corporation, which has a poor human rights record there. However, they would not commit to discontinuing the policy of vote turnbacks, and using offshore islands for unauthorised maritime arrivals. So that policy is still going to stand at this point as far as we know. And it seems that amongst for the so-called people who are still offshore, or the legacy coastline, their hope mostly rests with New Zealand, Canada, the new program, and the US. We've seen the first refugees also under the Community Refugee Integration Settlement Pilot, or CRISP, coming in, and their numbers will not be included in the overall tally, we're told. There's a major statement forthcoming and soon, but we need to be patient and persistently inquisitive about what's happening. Given so much at stake, will anything change? For health professionals, many of us believe that they may remain in detention, no longer accept the status quo. So our line on this from healthcare, is that governments have primary responsibility for detained asylum seekers' healthcare. It's often been put back to health professionals, like they're responsible, and this is a conceptual mistake. Healthcare or health professional, it's been too individualised. Health professional organisations need to negotiate minimum requirements for their members' participation to ensure independence, to prevent conflicts of interest, collaborating with systemic harms, and colleges need to unite in the health alliance over their conditions of participation and foregrounding ethics and pressuring governments over this contagious and inexcusable policy. What about the wider level? Just this morning we learned that independent Andrew Wilkie, I'm indebted to John Highfield for this information, supported by, who's on my left here, supported by fellow independents Kylie Tink, Zoe Daniel, Zoe Stegel, Monique Ryan, Allegra Stender and Zoe Scoms will introduce a bill to outlaw indefinite detention. But at a broader level, more is needed. Many of us, including in the Asylum Seekers Advocacy Group, believe a Royal Commission is imperative. There are three reasons for this broadly outlined. First, given these centres have been in private administration for 25 years, the only way to gain access to a true picture of the costs, tendering and contract processes and the treatment of people held within the camps is via the power of a Royal Commission, which provides the most substantive protections for asylum seekers and refugees to give evidence without fear of retaliation, either from Australia or from their country of origin. Second, as we saw in 2007, a change of government without a change of heart within the electorate means it's only a matter of time and pressure before the offshore camps are again full of people seeking Australia's protection. We believe the Royal Commission would reveal the truth of this policy, and in revealing that truth, it would undermine the policy and create a political appetite to remove the legislation that underpins the current regime. Finally, Australia's been leading the international community in development of practices that externalise border management. And as I said, a number of countries are adopting these practices. Without exposing the reality of life within the regime, the costs, both financial and reputational, there's no reason to believe the policy will not continue to inform international practice. So we need this. We need something that helps us to understand the treatment meted out to people held within these centres, the tendering and contractual delivery of services, the oversight and due diligence about taxpayers' money, the impact they've had on Australia's treaty obligations, reputation and social fabric. It's important to claim the restorative power of witnessing, to uncover the cruel purposes of this policy, to reveal its multifaceted costs, including for those in temporary protection, to expose immunity, for example, for sexual assault matters, serious medical neglect, remove deniability and restore accountability, to recover a time in history before the monster became orthodox bipartisan policy that controls our politicians and diminishes us as a nation, and to undermine its legitimacy, creating the appetite to remove the legislation that underpins it and prevents it being exported. We need to probably begin approaching the newly elected independents, Jackie Lambie, David Pocock, and others, and a number of whom seem to be potentially on board about a Royal Commission. There's a range of things that could be done in relation to this in terms of stories. We need narratives. We need stories that talk to this. We need young people involved, and we need vigils, and people need to write and visit their MPs. and run social media campaigns and lobby to get this up. I guess it would be great if we can actually kind of begin to kind of pursue these actions. There are a series of lesser alternatives, but they're less compelling than a Royal Commission. So I think I'll leave it at that, and happy to take questions with Aileen.
Fiona, I just wondered if, with the increasing extreme weather with climate change and what appears to be harsher conditions and perhaps a rise in autocratic governments, there's going to be more people fleeing for their impossible living conditions. We really don't we need to address this link actively and openly?
Completely agree with you. Wonderful comment, and I think sort of a number of Aileen and I and many of our confreres, including John and Trish and Rita and many people in this room who've been through this, have actually been at this for a long time. We need to have young people increasingly enlisted in these processes. We need intergenerational support and change. A lot of young people are signed on to climate change advocacy. This is the obvious bridge between that and refugees, climate refugees, and that's increasingly happening, and it provides an opportunity and a window for us to actually kind of begin to kind of put that proposal to young people who are involved in the climate advocacy movement, and also some of our professional links into that advocacy space as well.
It wouldn't be difficult for the government to take on some of these people because they're so anxious about getting people into Australia for different levels of employment. So I can't see why they can't be added to that quota system rather than even adding them to the other refugee humanitarian quota.
I'm Stephen Langford of Refugee Line weekly demonstration outside Town Hall from 4:30 p.m. Everyone's welcome to join us. I mean, for myself, this is kind of a fig leaf because Dad was a refugee and he was welcomed by New Zealand and people collected money for him to go to Canterbury University. So he was actually able to get life moving, get married, have kids. And that was before the Refugee Convention. I mean, to see that things are actually a spur to move backwards, having a convention that you've actually signed. The 51 convention, was Australia signed it in 53 or 56 or something?
Ratified in 57.
Yeah. Signed in 57, okay. Like, this is shocking, it's not mentioned on by the ABC, and because it's bipartisan, just like the betrayal of East Timor was completely bipartisan, it sounds good, bipartisan, that means the ABC won't report it. I was told by someone at the ABC when I rang in, well, both major parties agree with it, therefore it's not news. And this is exactly how it goes with the refugees. And shame on Four Corners for not doing it. They did a thing on the Uyghurs, and it was, I won't go to it. I wrote to Sally Neighbour, never got a reply. Never do from Sally Neighbour at the Four Corners. But we've decided to do something. It was actually Joe's idea to have a big banner on the front of the town hall saying refugees welcome, just like they have in Madrid, on Madrid's town hall, because Spain as a country didn't do much for refugees, only accepted 6,000 refugees in the time that Germany accepted 750,000. So I have a big, big banner on the front. It's unbelievable if you see the pictures of Spain's one. Anyway, we've got 15, 16, probably about 20. What? Endorsements. Endorsements, yes, for this. And it's being considered, a Greens councillor is helping us with this, which is great. We've got something from Joe Bano, the programs director, which tries to scotch the whole thing. This is actually what we need. No one knows that Sydney is a refugee welcome zone since 2006. So look, we have to get this through. A big flipping banner on the front of Town Hall saying refugees welcome. And this will open it up and stop it being a secret. Stop the Town Hall ticking boxes of some tokenistic stuff for refugees, and let people know in Australia's biggest city that we should be welcoming refugees. And what you're saying is will maybe help what you've so admirably said today get some traction. We've got to get this moving. This human rights, it's just not, people are not being told. Okay, if they're told, they may not give us stuff, but they have to be told first. So thank you. Yes, I don't know what the question is, but we come along to our demonstration every Friday if you like, rain or shine. Join our fig leaf, 4:30 p.m. Outside at every Friday. Sydney Town Hall. Yeah, thank you.
Would you like to comment, please, or will we? Well, let's take a question first.
Okay, Jim's my name, from Greenleaf and many other organisations. To me, listening to the speakers today, it provides a lot of background to what one is generally aware of, the actual specific background. And the enormous cognitive dissonance in the public discourse at the moment is the number one issue they're talking about, and this job summit was talking about, is we don't have enough workers in this country. We don't have enough workers in this country, and yet you've explained that there's, and it'd be great to be able to just get some more simplified version of this to say how many of our refugees are on no work, in a no work situation. It is ridiculous, and the mainstream media is totally full of this stuff about how we haven't got enough workers in the country. We've got workers who want to work and they're not being allowed to work. And there's one other issue, I'll just mention this. I was talking to a good friend of mine who's Palestinian and he's been in this country for a long time. He's an engineer. He's been here for quite a while. So many of these workers have qualifications. They are skilled workers, but they cannot for the life of them, and this has been going for decades, get recognition or access to some kind of upgrading. So I think I'm just saying, this is a window of opportunity at the moment. This huge discussion about how we need workers. We've got the workers here, and we won't even let them work. So I think that's a real big opening for us. Thank you.
We know for sure that a lot of the people who have been detained and who have fled their countries are highly skilled. The detention centre up in northern Western Australia, at one stage I think they had 9 doctors in detention. So the people that flee are generally the ones who are upsetting the government. So they're well trained. I mean, a number of my people were studying human rights and speaking out and challenging their governments, and so they had to flee. But they are generally well trained. One man, I went to see him after the siege in Martin Place. He was ballistic. He said those police don't know what they're doing. He was an intelligence officer in Colombia and he knew exactly what should have taken place. But he said, Australia, they're mad, they don't know what they're doing. So and he couldn't work. He was sitting in his home, in his kitchen, screaming.
Not mad, just incompetent. Sorry.
Just responding to that, I'll respond perhaps to Stephen's question first, or comment first. I mean, it's not news, and I guess this is true. We've grown desensitised to this information, and I said that the information is available to anyone who wishes to inquire. That's not actually strictly true, as I said, qualifying it, because you've unearthed extraordinary stories, Aileen. There are many stories that our group, have the Asylum Seekers Advocacy Group, and perhaps many people in this room have, that they carry, that are extraordinarily compelling stories that no one knows about. And so exposure by a Royal Commission on the freedom to testify is going to be extremely important in actually blowing this apart. And also social media, like the newspapers is fine, but to get it out and into other channels, I think may be helpful. I think the comment about the last comment was absolutely on the money as well. And thanks for your advocacy over so long, Stephen, in this space. We have a common cause here. The comment about not having enough workers, this is so true, isn't it? With no one coming in, and it actually completely kind of knocks on the head that old, kind of saw about, they'll take our jobs. It's a completely different situation, and it's an extraordinary opportunity which needs to be seized. But we need to work out why the Labor Party's running scared. I guess everyone's running scared because of the history, but somehow it's thinking about what is the real fear about here.
Well, the Murdoch media.
Sure, yeah. But there's still an enduring question about why the fear. Is it values conflict? Is it something to do with the values that new groups hold? Are they subversives? So we need to really examine these ideas thoroughly, and I think about, well, what does it mean to commit to a democracy? What does it mean to be signed on? And what's the social contract here for people coming? But there's deeper questions.
My name's Jenny, and I'm just very aware that we've got proposed legislation with regards to criminalising coercive control. And I'm just very, very interested in the wide-ranging implications if that becomes legislation to criminalise that behaviour. And listening to what you were saying, Aileen, it's just rampant throughout your whole book. So I'm just interested in your response to that.
Bring it on. I just think that it would be another tool in which to be able to fight the system. Because one of the big issues has been, what I discovered, was why the government would make new rules if the refugees won a case, so that next time they couldn't win it. And it was like for that detention, mandatory detention, where a person can stay forever, because that's what the government said. And that goes against the judges, who have an obligation to protect everybody in Australia, no matter who they are or what status they have an obligation. So therefore, the government's introducing discriminatory laws, which I don't know why the judges don't challenge that, actually.
That's a wonderful comment. Thank you so much for it. I mean, most refugees are women and children, aren't they? And violence is such a prevalent issue that's so often swept under the carpet with the people that we see, at least in the coalface in clinical practice, who are refugees. I think it's one of the issues that's going to need to be taken, really seriously as we consider trying to mount this as a really important point of argument.
Also interested in the treatment of the advocates, of the way they're being treated with bureaucrats at that level as well.
I'll just get another question so that you can just do the short time.
The two speakers have presented a horror story of aptly named hostile hospitality in Oz, and appears to me to be a disability rorts and robodebts intimidation combo, and it's sort of got this neoliberal policy of profiteering of disempowered and disadvantaged people. And that's also with a lethargic ear from the Labor Party. The secrecy and profits made by employers of sorry, I can't read my handwriting. Of profits made from legal fees, rorting of legal fees, work done because people can't complain about conditions, and this is not only refugees. These are overseas workers, Australian farmers doing this. It seems to be, let's see what we can get off them. And then we'll send them back. Now, that memorable failed campaign of ScoMo's, where the bloody hell are you? Charming sort of PR. Well, the answer to that is, now that we've arrived in Australia, we are in hell. Anyway, that's a comment, and that's the way I see it. So, I think the two speakers are really to be commended, which can be actually quite scary, standing up to these faceless people with all the power on behalf of others. And I don't know if anyone else agrees with me, but anyway, that's my comment. It's more of a comment than a question.
To add to that, I just want to ask a question. The whole system seems to be so absurd, so insane. We want to welcome them, and there are people who don't want to welcome them. Yet we need jobs. We claim to be good neighbors, yet we frown on climate refugees, those disasters we are responsible for. And we don't seem to know what we want as a nation. We are more ruled by fears and insecurities and desires. And at this point, I would rather than ask Australians what we want, I'd like to even ask the refugees, what do you want from Australia, considering this is how you're being treated even before you arrive? You want to answer the question?
No, sorry, no.
Well, if I can dare to speak on behalf of the refugees, all they want is security. They want to be able to have a place where they can live safely and bring up their children in a decent atmosphere. So that's what they would be wanting. The system itself is, well, like, I read all the decisions and they sound quite logical. They're all very logical, and they're legal because they're usually approved by the lawyers. But they're wrong. They're logical, but they're not right. That's what surprised me when I started to analyse it. I thought, this is weird.
really weird.
It's stacked, isn't it? I mean, yeah. It's stacked in every sense, yeah. Yeah, and Aileen's got for those of you who don't know the book, has an amazing diagram at the end that makes absolutely no sense at all. And the way the system works. Yeah. In terms of treatment of advocates, look, just coming back to your point earlier, I totally agree that, I think there has a huge cost for people who persist in this area, and people, there's been attempts, I guess, to document that to some extent, I think it makes the costs are still very high even for whistleblowing in this context for people who know stuff and yet can't afford to disclose it. Very, very difficult. And again, a Royal Commission would demand accountability, would demand a higher, transparency, which would actually, hopefully, get behind this, the way the system's actually set up. It's gained that way to not be transparent, and we need to actually, like I said, we really need to see a change in the culture.
Just from the treatment, I was called into the office by some of the head shrangs in Lee Street here, and I thought they were going to help me with the case, but instead they told me how dangerous it was that I was working in this area, and that I had to be very careful of myself, and that in actual fact I should stop. And one of the RRT reviewers actually said, I think you're working illegally, because I wasn't a lawyer. And lawyers weren't allowed to help the people once they had been right through the system. They're not allowed to help them anyway. So they told me I was illegal. So I went to a friend who was a barrister, and he just said, Aileen, bring it on, bring it on.
Thank you, Jenny, for raising the issue of coercion and control. I would submit that since 1788, that's what we've lived with.
Yes.
That's how this country was invaded and started, with coercive control by the
colonials
as a system. And in the immigration department, we don't see very much difference to that. It's not about humanity for refugees; it's about coercive control of refugees and how we treat them. So nothing has much changed. There are some amusing sides, of course, to this. You mentioned, Aileen, that the advocate, the member told you that there was an algorithm for 80-20. They fail 80% of cases and okay 20%. One of the members who was not renewed, a wonderful former diplomat, Bruce Haig, was put on the Refugee Review Tribunal. And they gave him this algorithm that he had to conform with, and they just told him 80-20. So he allowed 80% in and rejected only 20%, and his contract wasn't renewed the following year. He only lasted 1 year on the tribunal. The other thing is, Trish and I had a young Hazara lad staying with us who had come at the age of 14 on a boat to Ashmore Reef when his family feared one of the earlier Taliban problems, and he ended up in the Woomera Detention Centre before being released here in Sydney when he came to live with us in our house when he was released from Billaward. And he was telling us when he went through his interview, the immigration department representative asked him a question in order to verify that he was telling the truth as to what colour the flowers of the almond trees were on his father's farm back in Afghanistan. And he replied white. And the member who was interviewing him said, no, you're wrong. They are pinkish white. I mean, that's how stupid it is. Other RRT members have admitted using the Lonely Planet Guide to get country information. And that's on the record. So we do have a coercive control system which is operated, and a Royal Commission is sorely needed into the whole department. Sorry, I haven't asked the question. But yeah, I think that they're relevant points. And thank you, Jenny. It goes right across the board.
Yeah, hi. I've just got a comment first up. I mean, it's great that there are doctors, well, it's not great, but there are doctors, there are engineers ready to come and work right now in this country. But we also need cafe workers, fruit pickers, dishwashers, and I'm sure that they would jump at those opportunities. So that's my comment. But my question is, I'm wondering how much you think that the general public and the media feel that they've kind of done their job, because the Billa Wheeler family is now back in Billa Wheeler. You know, they're off the front page, and and the general public as well think, well, we've kind of done our job, we've got the family home, and now they're turning their eyes away from that.
It's a good question. It has another side to it, in the sense that a lot of refugee advocates across the country have received a bit of hope, in the sense that if they could do that for them, they might do something for the others that are hanging. You know, how many? What is it? 30,000, 31,000 or something on temporary protection visas, and others as well. So the general public, I think, are becoming more aware, and I think that's happened because now the refugees are their neighbours. In the early days, they were people in detention, and the media couldn't look at them, and the only time the media got near them was when they had arrived, and then they could all come and take whatever photos. But other than that, these people were strange people that you had to be afraid of. But nowadays, they're in the shopping centre, they're in the queues at the supermarkets and so forth. So people are much more aware, but I don't know how much they're prepared to fight for it.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you for that question. I think stereotyping has been notorious, you know, throughout this whole, and it's been farmed, you know, to a great degree during this whole epoch. And I think you're right, Aileen, it's true, isn't it? Context makes this huge difference. I think forays into other human rights areas and the changing, you know, not only the changing of the guard politically in terms of political parties, but also the emerging issues like climate change and all the other issues that young people are so incredibly sensitive to now, actually gives an opportunity to actually redress some of those problems, you know, and brings, like, young people are far more concerned, according to the Scanlon survey these days, about issues of social justice than they were, say, even 5 years ago. And I think there's, you know, a possibility that we may be able to harness that.
Thank you very much. I'd like to say that I learned 2 things today, very important things. One is the system isn't broken because the system delivers exactly the results we see. But also, we need to build a home. I think what the refugees and immigrants want is a home. I came here because I wanted to join my parents in building a home here. We all want to build a home. So hopefully we go home and build one for ourselves and for one another. And a lady wants to give the last question. Miss Muriel.
I'm Vivian Langford. I just have a very simple question. How well organised do you feel, both of you who are really ensconced in it, is the refugee human rights movement? Because it seems very fragmentary to me. Afghan people, you know, when that all happened, Afghanistan was evacuated, all our troops got out, and so many people who were absolutely implicated by their association with us have been left behind. Occasional members, just spots of me, you know, but I don't get the impression that there's a really organised rebellion against that by anything that you could call a refugee movement. Maybe I'm wrong. Amnesty International pops up. Various groups, I know all of us in this room know various groups, but how coordinated or well organised do you both feel it is, and what more can be done to give energy to that? You know, so that the Australian public can't avoid hearing about this.
Can I just take 1 sentence? Thank you, but I didn't mention that Rashida, who is here, and Caroline also regularly, very often come
Speak
to...
into the microphone.
Yeah. Caroline and Rashida very often come to our Friday 4:30 p.m. demonstrations outside the town hall. And everyone's welcome. It's a kind of a forum. That was how it was intended. So thank you, Rashida and Caroline, as well as Joe. And how do we get a Royal Commission?
There's a meeting happening on Thursday, the 15th of September. It's at the Catholic Centre, Renwick Street, Leichhardt, 38 Renwick Street, Leichhardt, 10:30 to 12:30. And we're trying to build an alliance with organisations of all kinds, including all the groups you're sort of alluding to. I completely agree with your comment. John gave us the figures yesterday at our meeting. It was, 35,000, John, and 1,000, they've accepted 1,000, is that right? From Afghanistan, I'm talking about.
40, there's been 45,000 applications from Afghanistan.
Yeah,
and we've only done 1,000. So.
Yeah, I'm glad. And yeah, because you wonder about that in a major way. But I think, I don't have an answer to your point. I don't think I know the sector well enough, and that's huge. I agree. And it is really disunited. It seems to me. And I inhabit one tiny part of it. But I think we're hoping to build an alliance or a coalition across a whole lot of groups to actually get this job done, to get this up, and hoping that people will come, bring potential friends or representatives. Julie Mackin is the driver. She's absolutely a firebrand, and she's been absolutely extraordinary in the way she's been talking to the politicians and lots of people to try to get this moving, and we are in support of this. So we're deadly serious about getting this done.
Is there a website or somewhere where people can
I don't think we've got a website yet. This is currently a group that's got we've had one meeting. We had one meeting last month, and we're continuing to pursue it. And we've already had some good information, which I'm not in a position to divulge. But she's been walking around the independents, and we're getting places already with this. There's a great interest about doing this.
The capital cities generally run a large rally a couple of times a year. There's been some fantastic rallies in Melbourne, Sydney too, and Brisbane. But the group that has the finger on most things is the Refugee Council of Australia, RCOA. They do a lot of negotiating with the government regarding policy, but they also have a list of a lot of the refugee groups right across Australia. So they have a big network that they interact with.
We're going to wind up, guys. We've gone well past, and I want to really show your appreciation to Aileen and Mark.